you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nancy Netzer, inaugural Robert L. and Judith T. Winston Director of the McMullen Museum and Professor of Art History at Boston College. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this members preview lecture for Medieval Renaissance, a dialogue on Italian painting, which is now on view in our Daily Family Gallery. This exhibition brings together 19 outstanding works from Florence's distinguished Frazione collection, founded more than a century ago by the great-grandfather of Federico Gandolfi Vanini, and today thoughtfully stewarded by Federico and his wife, Daisy Diaz, a graduate of the Boston College class of 2001. We're grateful for their generous loan, and we're delighted that they're here with us today on this Zoom. The exhibition's been curated by two of our Boston College colleagues, Professors John Lansdowne and Stephanie Leone, whose complementary expertise in medieval and Renaissance art, respectively, enriches the dialogue at the heart of this exhibition. By approaching these paintings from their distinct disciplinary perspectives, the curators invite visitors to reflect anew on traditional art historical classifications of Italian painting from the late 13th through the early 16th centuries. For this exhibition, we're also indebted to our talented McMullen team, as well as to those whose steadfast support makes exhibitions like this possible. The administration of Boston College, the McMullen Family Foundation, and the patrons of the McMullen Museum, so ably chaired by Mike Daly and vice-chaired by James McDermott. And now it's my privilege to introduce our distinguished speakers. John Lansdowne joined the Department of Art, Art History, and Film in 2024 as Assistant Professor of Medieval Art. A Boston College alumnus, he went on to earn an MPhil in Classical Archaeology from Oxford University and a PhD in Medieval Art from Princeton University. His research explores cultural exchange in the later Middle Ages between Western Christendom and the broader East Christian and Islamic worlds. His scholarship has appeared in leading journals, and his article, Compounding Greekness in Gesta, was awarded the 2023 Van Cortlandt Elliott Prize by the Medieval Academy of America. His current book project, Fraction Equals Union, examines visual allegories for ecumenical union, uniting peoples and nations into an undivided worldwide church. Currently, he's also the co-leader of a major project on portable mosaic artifacts, a collaboration among art historians, conservators, image scientists, and materials scientists. Stephanie Leone, professor of Italian Renaissance and Baroque art history, focuses her research on Rome, particularly patronage, the papal court, domestic architecture, and material culture. She received her PhD from Rutgers University. Her book, The Palazzo Pamphili in Piazza Navona, Constructing Identity in Early Modern Rome, remains a landmark study of the city and its transformations under Pope Innocent X and the Pamphili family. Building on this work, she has organized international collaborations that explore the wide-ranging influence of Innocent X across the arts, and she's just completed a new book manuscript, Building for the Holy Year, Innocent X Pamphili and Architecture in Rome, which examines how the Pope renovated the city for the Jubilee of 1650. Now, Professors Lansdowne and Leone will speak for about 45 minutes, after which we'll have time for your questions. Please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A as the lecture unfolds. And now it's my pleasure to invite our speakers to begin their presentation.
So thank you so much, Nancy, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, Rachel, to John, Diana, all the people at the McMullen for helping to make this happen. And we also want a special thanks also to Federico and to Daisy for this truly wonderful opportunity. This has been a spectacular chance for us to really work with our students, to bring them primary source material to work with directly, and also a wonderful research opportunity working with scholars both within our institution and outside at places in the Boston area. So it's a really exciting thing to have at the museum, and we're excited to have the opportunity to speak with you about it today. The idea for this exhibition, when we were given this chance, we wanted to take this opportunity to explore the kind of the gray area between what is considered to be the later Middle Ages and the early Renaissance period. It's this area, this time period that witnessed really profound transformations in the art of painting. New materials and techniques are giving way to this expanded repertoire of formats and artistic styles. And there's all these kind of paradigm shifting developments that really ramified into the academic study of this painting in the 19th century and the 20th century as well. And this really created this line of distinction between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance that has been very, very difficult to kind of redraw over the ages. And early Italian painting, as we talked about this in exhibition, is really this arena where this distinction is challenged and blurred. So we wanted to pose this exhibition as a dialogue. Stephanie and I come from similar backgrounds. We've spent time at the same research institutes in Florence and in Rome. We both are focused in Italy around the same time period. But our training is quite different. I come from a medieval art historian's perspective, and Stephanie really comes from a Renaissance art historian's perspective. And so that has been a really exciting opportunity to kind of look at specific works and compare the different perspectives, the things that we kind of immediately jumped at through this exhibition. So throughout the course of the exhibition, we each have our own object files or object labels, but some of them are paired. So coming from two different perspectives to put that directly on display. Turn to Stephanie for a moment. Yeah.
There we go.
Thank you. And just to key off of kind of the perspective that I'm coming from, we start off with this quote, and this is from a Dominican preacher named Giordano da Pisa, a major figure in the late 13th and early 14th century. And he gives this particular sermon on the Feast of the Epiphany in the years 1305, 1306 at Santa Maria Novella, famous church in Florence. And he's using images in his sermon, and he's talking about images of the Magi specifically. And he says, the figures of the saints were depicted just as they originally were, in the same appearance and in the same condition and in the same style. And I think that this quote, embedded in this quote, are really some questions that are at the heart of art historical inquiry, right? What is it that gives art value? What is it that makes an image real? For centuries after antiquity, authenticity or truth in visual representation was really measured by the degree of its connection to distant prototypes. In the later Middle Ages, this age-old metric was in flux. Late medieval commentators' obsessions with the origins of objects and elusive artistic sources really kind of signaled this fundamental reconfiguration of the criteria for verisimilitude in art. Okay, that's the idea of the art's perception of realness. And I think that driving this value shift was a culture-wide pursuit of verifiable proof. And so something that really is a change between my period, the period that I'm looking at, or the approach that I'm coming from, and Stephanie's approach, is this idea of the rise of the artist, right? The emergence of the artist, which is something that's so essential to the story of the Renaissance. And this is something that's kind of consistently in flux and something we really explore in the exhibition. So I'll turn it over to Stephanie a little bit, and we'll come back to some of that perspective.
Thank you, John, and thanks to everybody. So John was just talking about what gives art value and talking about how art is a way to verify the events, the mysteries of Christianity. And this holds true in my perspective as a Renaissance art historian. Art very much continued to be used for devotional religious purposes. But there's also some major changes that are happening in culture, in religion, and those influence the way that art is made and the way that art is represented, the way that holy figures are represented. So the quote that I've chosen um, to highlight the importance of Renaissance studies is this one from a woman humanist named Cassandra Fedele. And she was a writer, an intellectual. She spoke and wrote Greek and Latin fluently in the late 15th century. Her father recognized her intellectual prowess and encouraged her to continue and to also set her up with a scholar who could train her and teach her. And she has various moments of fame. Well, she's very much tied into humanist circles in the 15th century. And in one moment, she wrote a letter in praise of learning and in praise of education. And this was read aloud as an oration in 1487. And I think that this quote, for what is it that enlightens men's minds, the way that an education in and knowledge of literature and the liberal arts do, really gets to the core of the cultural movement that's taking place in the 15th century that signals the shift in art. We're at a moment when antiquity is being looked at more closely. It's being seen with fresh eyes. There's a new sense that there are greater fields of knowledge that can be learned by people of various social means and including artists. So there's this sense that if we return to the past and if we look at ancient architecture and ancient sculpture, ancient writers, that we can gain new knowledge. And artists take part in this, and this really stimulates a new way of thinking about the artist, which John has already signaled. This idea that artists not only are they trying to reproduce and to perpetuate the images of the past, but that they can also add variations to them. They can approach these works of art in new ways. And through studying geometry, through studying poetry and literature, that they have something to add to Christian art, to the way that art has appeared for centuries. And one of these things that they do, or one of these things that they add to art, is the interest in nature and this idea of verisimilitude that John also signaled already. The sense that art should emulate the natural world, and that could be brought together with Christian art to create art for religious purposes that is even more efficacious, that's more persuasive. And in that way, art continues to be something that can be taught and used in religious practices, but it can also be sort of married with this idea of antiquity and with humanist studies. And so this really sets up a kind of development, a major development that we can see influencing the art of the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. So to get into that just a little bit more, and I probably should not have been the one who's in charge of switching the slides because I'm having a little trouble with that, but I think I've got the hang of it now. But to think about how these ideas and how humanism, which was a cultural movement taking place in the 15th century, how did that then influence the way that we understand art history? We can think about the first written account of the history of Italian art. And that takes place in the 16th century. And it's a book called The Lives of the Artists, written by Giorgio Vasari. And we see obviously a modern edition here in the center of this slide. He published his book first in 1550, then he revised it and republished it in 1568. And Vasari is very important for the development of art history, for classification in Italian art, because he was the first one to organize Italian art into a series of time periods. And he looks back to the past, and he's very much, of course, influenced by humanists. He looks back to the past and says that art had reached what he calls a summit of perfection in antiquity. And that is a great model that artists should follow. And then he says that after that, at the end of the Roman Empire, in the Middle Ages, he says, quote, barbarian nations ruined everything and art has fallen into complete ruin. So he sees this period where all of those principles and all of the achievements of antiquity are lost. And then he talks about a third period. And this, of course, is his own present, as well as the very recent past. Starting around the year 1300, Vasari identifies a rebirth in art. And he says that again, art reaches a state of perfection. And he traces this development of rebirth and perfection from 1300 to the time of his publication in 1568. And he sees it as a linear development, and he sees it as a process that takes place through the biographies of individual artists. And he starts with an artist named Giotto, and he continues to pick out whom the artists that he sees as the heroes of this development. People like Masaccio, Brunelleschi, Donatello in the 15th century. And then in the 16th century, he argues that art attains perfection through artists like Leonardo, Raphael, but especially Michelangelo. And of course, he claims to be the student of Michelangelo. So he's setting himself up in this linear development because he's not only a writer about art, but he is also a painter and an architect himself. So he creates this framework and it really takes hold. And if we move forward a couple of centuries, as the discipline of art history is developing and sort of solidifying and becoming an academic discipline, something that you can study at university. In the 19th century, we have a historian named Burckhardt. We don't have a picture of his book here, but he did write a book in 1860 called The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. And he's the one who first names the time period as the Renaissance. He follows Vasari, but he's a historian. He's looking more broadly at cultural and historical events and developments. But he's very important because he solidifies Vasari's conception that the Middle Ages and the Renaissance are two distinct things. He draws this line that John had mentioned. And then other historians and art historians, people like Bernard Berenson, and here we have an image, a photograph of Berenson's book on Italian pictures. They pick up on this, and they're early art historians who are continuing to define the discipline. And they follow along with this idea of periodization, distinction between medieval and Renaissance. Berenson, in particular, as one of these early art historians, he was very interested in connoisseurship, which means that he's looking at paintings, he's attributing them to certain artists. We do have a lot of artist signatures in the Renaissance, but there are also a lot of works that are not signed. So he's giving them names, he's placing them into different schools, he's sort of organizing the history for us. And he's also an art dealer. So his attribution of works of art had an impact on how he could sell them, and it gave them value. So he reinforces this idea that an artist's name has value as well. So at this point, I'll turn it over to John to bring us a little bit closer to the present day.
Yeah. Thanks, Stephanie. And just just one of the other kind of theories and texts that really is kind of cutting through our exhibition is this book we see on the right, Likeness and Presence by Hans Belting, originally published in 1990, English edition in 1994. And this book is a real product of what you call the anthropological turn in art history, medieval art history, most especially. And he really establishes a different kind of periodization, which again is not hard and fast, but it's about the functionality of images, right? And essentially talking about an era of the image and then the era of art, right? And the era of the image is this era in which images that have a primary function as devotional objects, okay? They are categorized and typed on the basis of their functional criteria. And that is a separation from this kind of era of the artist in which art is made for art's sake, in which art has an established artist. Authorship becomes a huge part of the thing that essentially establishes authority and authenticity and legitimacy within representation, within images. And so this is another thing that's really kind of cutting through our exhibition, is this not binary, but this large kind of spectrum, gray area between this erage of the image and the erage of art. And now I think we can move on to talking just directly about some of the works that we have in the exhibition. And I just have to say, we're just so lucky to have each and every one of these works. This one is one of the many stars of the show and is really framed wonderfully by our exhibition designers right when you walk in on the right-hand side. This is a croce di pinta, so a painted cross, painted crucifix, a real wonderful collaboration between painters and carpenters. This is the earliest work we have in the exhibition, dating back to probably the late 13th century, and has been attributed to either Umbria or Marche, the regions in Italy. It's a really wonderful image of Christ essentially crucified on the cross. On either side of him, you have the Virgin Mary, and then John the Apostle or John the Evangelist directly next to him. But you can see that Christ's body really stands forward. It's bright white against this much darker background. Stephanie, you talk a little bit more about kind of the way in which the body is figured specifically. But one thing that I really want to call attention to very specifically is the modular construction of Christ's body here. You can see how he's just the articulation between the different joints in his arm, in his knees, in his leg, in his pectoral muscles, and most especially that amazing abdomen, that bread basket. And it's almost this idea with this modularity of construction, this idea that Christ could almost be pieced apart and put back together in the viewer's mind. This is an image that would have stood upon something called a tramezzo, okay, a choir screen on direct axis with the altar where the Eucharistic sacrament and miracle is taking place. And this image would have been a fantastic stand-in for the Eucharistic host, which was lifted up bright white and brought forward to the congregation just like an image like this. I want to call to mind, once again, especially that wonderful image of the abdomen, so modular and broken in its construction, almost like a bread basket. And this is something that, again, I find particularly striking about this image type. Stephanie.
Thanks, John. So I approach this painting as being a watershed in the history of Italian art. It is very much rooted in devotional practices, as John explained. It would have been exposed to the congregation as a point of focus during the Mass, as a way for them to contemplate the sacrifice of Christ. But I also see it as heralding a shift to a new way of thinking about Christianity and a new way to thinking about art. And so this was made around the year 1300, probably in the 1290s. And that's a period, the 13th century, in which the Franciscan order is very active. And St. Francis died only in 1226. He established the order. It was approved in 1209. He introduced, St. Francis of Assisi, he introduced a new way of relating to Christ, to the Virgin Mary, to the saints, and to God. And it was really revolutionary about the time. That's something that I always like to tell students, that he was a real revolutionary because he really wanted people to be able to feel closer to God, to Christ, to Mary. And he encouraged people to relate to them, to think about them as humans. And of course, Christ being the incarnation of God, he focused on Christ's life as a man, the events of his life. He would tell them in very passionate, persuasive sermons to people. He focused on the suffering of Christ on the cross. And this cross in particular, we know, is directly associated with St. Francis and the Franciscan movement because of the two figures on either side of his hands. And I hope that you can see those. I'll show you briefly. I want to show you St. Francis here in detail, but I'll go back to the larger image for just a minute, and then we'll come back to that detail. So because of the appearance of Francis and Clare here, we believe, and it's good proof, that it was hanging in a Franciscan church. We don't know which one. But here it's a nice connection because we see that those concerns of Francis and the way that he wanted Christians to relate and to understand Christ was, as I said, was through his human side. And what we see in this work of art, in this painting, is a very different way of depicting Christ than we typically would have seen leading up to this moment. Previous crucifixions showed Christ alive on the cross with his eyes wide open, his body very rigid, very symmetrical, no sense of movement. And then in the late 13th century, because of these new ideas of Christianity that Francis introduces, we start to see a focus on Christ as human and the suffering of Christ. And this type of cross where Christ is shown deceased with his eyes closed is called the Christus Patiens, so the suffering Christ. And so that's a first indication that we're thinking about the body of Christ, the physical form of Christ. But then we also see that this unknown master, we don't have a name for him, a historical name for him, but he's also changing the way that he represents Christ. He is certainly abstracted the way that John described, but at the same time, there's a greater sense of weight in this figure of Christ than we see in earlier figures of Christ, where his body weight is shifting off to one side, one foot is pulled in front of the other. There's a sense of the body in space. So at the same time that Francis is encouraging Christians to focus on Christ as a human, we see artists representing the body of Christ as being more human. And along with that, well, we can also think about the halo here. That halo is a very solid object, and it is a separate object that has been attached to the crucifix, to that wooden panel. And it's a separate piece of wood that has been gilded, and then it bends forward to our space. So again, emphasizing three-dimensional quality here. And then if we look really closely at Francis, and on the opposite side is Saint Clare, who founded the Sister Order of Nuns. And if we look closely at Francis, this is a detail that I love because Francis has a great expression on his face. And so the artist, the painter, is communicating to us through the facial expression of Francis. And he shows Francis holding up his hands, holding up his stigmata, which occurred when he was praying to Christ, and Christ appeared to him and he received the same wounds of Christ on his own body. And so this was Christ's demonstration of his approval and his love for Francis and his approval of what Francis was doing. But I think what's so wonderful, that kind of look of wonder on Francis's face as he holds up his hand and compares it to the hand of Christ, almost in disbelief that he could have the same kinds of wounds on his own body. So we see that the artist is thinking about physicality, three-dimensional form, space, and we also see artists concerned with emotion and introducing those characteristics into the representation of Christian subjects.
If you can think about the kind of the broad spectrum of image types that you have within Christian art. On the one side, you have the iconic image, which we just saw, something that is kind of essentially outside of time or timeless. And then you have on the other side of the spectrum, the historia or the narrative image. And this is an example of one of these wonderful narrative images that we have, something that is sliced from time, okay? And this particular narrative that we're showing here is the image of the Lamentation. This is a very, very intimate scene of the figure of Christ being mourned by his loved ones. We can see Christ's horizontal supine body, Mary on the left-hand side, the women of Galilee, John the Apostle right beneath the cross, and then on the right-hand side, gathering his feet, is the image of Mary Magdalene. Foregrounding the entire scene is the wonderful cross in the background, which has since faded to black, but it was originally probably a deep blue, and it really kind of pushes that all the figures kind of forward into our space, that space of encounter. And really particularly wonderful about this image is this figure who's standing, the figure of Nicodemus, okay? He's a vague figure within the Gospels, but in the later Middle Ages, the exact period that we're exploring within this exhibition, legends developed that Nicodemus was a sculptor, okay? So that he was an artist. And indeed, we have many surviving crucifixes all around Italy that are attributed to his legendary authorship. I think what's so wonderful is that Nicodemus, you can see here he has the nails in his pocket, he has a hammer in his hand, and he's set back from the rest of the family. He's kind of observing what's happening because he's the eyewitness of the event, just like an artist, right? He is the person who is stepping back and who is going to be responsible for portraying this event and then communicating it and portraying it, conveying it to the rest of the audience. And I think there's something particularly special about the representation of Nicodemus in this image because this particular painting.
I think she's gonna want to sleep in our bedroom, probably.
this particular, excuse me, uh, I think that was maybe my niece, and so I just want to send a quick shout out just to say hello. Thank you for joining in. Um, this particular painting is really wonderful because we know that it was attributed to a painter named whose name was Niccolò di Pietro. So his name is very similar to Nicodemus, and so there's a way in which the artist kind of sees himself in the representation of Nicodemus in this image. And then we move on to another image that takes us back into the iconic part of the image binary, image of the Maestà. This is a very, very large scale image. The last image we showed you was actually quite small and intimate, delicate, and beautiful. Here we have the enthroned Madonna holding the infant Christ, again, set against this resplendent cloth of honor, which kind of focuses the view of the devotee, the person looking at this image, and then also pushes the image forward into our space. And then to the left of that of the image of the Madonna and Child is a probably a Latin father of the church, a bishop saint, maybe Ambrose or Augustine. And then to our right, the image of Saint Michael, who's weighing souls of the dead, the deceased.
And so, as John's talking about, this is an iconic image, and it's one that ultimately goes back to icons of the Virgin and Child that were believed to be painted by St. Luke. So, there's that idea of an image as verification of Christian figures of Mary and Christ. What's interesting to me about this painting is that at the same time that it communicates this religious meaning, we also see that the artist is starting to play around with form and space and sort of updating the style of it. So there are many aspects of this, as John described, the gold background, the cloth of honor that are objects and a way to approach this image that has been going on for centuries. But we also see that this master, and here we don't know his historical name again, called the Master of Barberino. That was a way of attributing authorship to an unknown painter. So this master is demonstrating his interest in the naturalistic world and into representing Mary and Christ as human figures. And we can see that this very wonderfully in the figure of Mary herself. I mean, first of all, she is a weighty figure. Her lap is well articulated through the use of light and shadow. And you can see, not sure if you can see my pointer here, but you can see some highlights, an indication of where her knees project, and then that heavy blue drapery, blue being a typical color for the Virgin Mary, representing the divine realm, her place in heaven, which this is a representation of her as the Queen of Heaven, the Maestà. But this beautiful blue with lighter highlights and then deeper shadows, indicating how that fabric sort of folds over her knees. And then another detail that really helps us to understand how her body is situated in space and not just simply floating is that ermine lining. So that white band that you see going through the middle represents ermine. So that's a fur representing her royalty, and you can see how it curves around her lap and suggests again the sense that she is a three-dimensional woman. So a woman as well as a holy figure, as well as a saint. And the body of Christ too, sits rather convincingly in his mother's arm. And turns in a naturalistic manner to Saint Michael on his left-hand side. And I love this image of Saint Michael and how he's holding the scale of judgment. And we have one man, the blessed man, who is being raised up, and then the other man who is being damned. So this is the weighing of the souls, the judgment, the last judgment that is to come. And we see just the absolute horror and terror of the man who is facing damnation. And the devil is right down between them, ready to grab the other man if he is deemed to be not worthy of salvation. And what's something very interesting that we've seen in this is that there's somebody later on made an X through the face of the devil. So when you go to see this in person, look closely at it as a way of, reacting against the devil, really interactively with this painting. And this is something that we see in Renaissance art. I mean, certainly we don't do these kinds of things in museums today, but there was a kind of interaction with images. But getting back to that idea of naturalism, This painting is sort of, again, as John was saying, in that murky zone between medieval and Renaissance. There are aspects of it that are very iconic, that are very traditional, those gold leaf halos. Yet at the same time, the artist is signaling that he's aware of trends in art and the interest in humanizing the holy figures. And there's a great prototype for this, which I don't have an image to show you, but you may know it because it's done by the artist Giotto, and it's in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. And our artist is basing this Maestà on Giotto's Maestà that was hanging in Florence at the time. So we start to see this idea of artistic lineage and a work of art accruing value because of other works of art that it is associated with. I'm sorry, one final point that I don't want to forget to make, the goldfinch. And this I have to give credit to Diana Larson of the McMullen Museum. She looked very closely at it. The goldfinch is a symbol of the Passion of Christ. This is a very naturalistic looking goldfinch. It's red and white head, the black body. It looks very much like a European goldfinch if you Google that on your phone. So here the artist, again, thinking of the natural world, placing these figures into the natural world so that viewers, worshipers can relate directly to them. Okay. Oh, right. The next slide is also I will continue to talk about a little bit because these are in the same room. And I introduced these two images. We have a tondo, meaning a round painting by Luca Signorelli of the Holy Family on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, we have another round painting. So very easy to see that these are the same format, two round paintings. But this one on the right-hand side was a birth tray. So it was an actual tray that was used to bring refreshments to a mother who had just given birth. And then we believe at some later moment, probably this frame was added and there's now a foot on it. So that was probably added so that it could be displayed in the home. So the point here is that during the 15th century and into the 16th century, we see this great development in different kinds of art objects, things that didn't exist before. I mean, certainly we know there are representations of the Virgin and Child, but this idea of placing them into a tondo in a round format, personalizing the scene. And in the tondo that we have on the left-hand side, we see the Virgin Mary with the Christ child, Saint Joseph. So that's the Holy Family. And then on their sides are Saint John the Baptist, the naked man with a hair shirt, and then Saint Francis on the other side. So we find that there are new typologies for paintings. New subject matters are introduced in the Renaissance. And part of this is done because people begin to want to fill their homes with works of art. This relates to the economic circumstances of the period. It was a period of great prosperity in central Italy. Cities are developing, people are living more closely together, looking at what each other has. And preachers are also encouraging people to hang religious devotional works of art in the home so that they can be used as guides, as moral instructional guides for children and for the family. Now, the image on the right-hand side, the birth tray, that is a painted wooden panel. And we see that there's a child, a baby on it. And we're still trying to figure out exactly what is going on in this panel. Typically in birth trays, we see a naked child on the backside. Childbirth was a very dangerous thing during this time period. Only about 50% of children lived to adulthood. So Italians commemorated the birth of children, celebrated the birth of children, and wanted objects that would bring good wishes to the family and hope that they would have a successful birth and a healthy child, let's say. So this child wears a coral necklace of beads and a cross, and coral is an apotropaic device. So it's a device that brings good luck. So this is certainly a kind of commemorative object, something that was supposed to usher in good luck to the family. But this, relates back to that, the great opportunity that we have here to study these objects more closely and to try to figure out more specifically their meaning. One final work that I will mention before I pass this on to John is another painting of the Virgin and Child. And this one shows also St. John the Baptist. So a lot of the paintings in the exhibition are images of the Virgin and Child. They're small to medium size, and that helps to signal to us that these were works of art that were hung in the home, again, to be used for instruction. In Florence, in particular, John the Baptist was a central figure because he was and is the patron saint, one of the patron saints of the city. His birthday of the 24th of June is still a big celebration in Florence today. And preachers encourage families to use him as a model. We see him on the lower right-hand side of this painting. He's shown here as a child. He plays a big role in Christianity because he was a prophet. He pointed to the coming of Christ. He's the first one to identify Christ as divine after the birth of Christ. And he's shown here wearing his hair shirt because he went out into the desert and he prayed. He's also carrying his reed cross, again, because he was the first one to identify Christ as divine. And here we have this nice interaction. They're cousins, Christ and John the Baptist. And we have this nice interaction between the Christ child, who is blessing his cousin, and playing with the book in a very playful manner. So he looks like a sort of, chubby, natural baby here playing with the book. But of course, he is the Word of God. So there's great symbolic meaning to that as well. And then he is blessing his cousin, who reverently looks up at him. So you could sort of imagine this in a household in the late 15th century. To be used as an instructional model for children, to have them model themselves after those devotional practices, and certainly the sense of penitence of John the Baptist and his devotion to Christ. The final thing that I'll say about this is that this is a painting done by the Ghirlandaio workshop, and that was one of the major workshops in Florence in the late 15th century. It is the workshop in which Michelangelo trained. There's a nice connection to us at Boston College. So this workshop tradition continues, but then within it, we see a great amount of innovation. And the painting that I'm showing you on the left-hand side is by an artist named Michele Tosini, and it represents the exact same subject matter, the Madonna and Child with John the Baptist. But you can see how the style is quite different. Tosini was, he entered into the Ghirlandaio workshop after Domenico Ghirlandaio died. His brother Davide and then his son Rodolfo took over the workshop. So this is a workshop that extends into the mid-16th century. Tosini joins it, and he eventually becomes the lead master in this workshop. So we have this continuation of a medieval tradition of workshop training and production, but artists are seeking to create an inimitable style, a style that's associated with their hand alone, rather than repeating the style of their predecessors. John, did you have anything that you want to say about this, or are we ready to move on?
Wonderful. Let's just pick up right directly into this idea of the workshop tradition, and how essential that is to this period in Italian art. People have heard of the guild system, which develops alongside the development of cities and republics. Guild system was essentially a system run by civic governments that provided standardization of quality control within imagery, which dictated how artists were trained, which dictated who could become a master, dictated how commodity or how art was sold, prices, also the kind of materials that went into artwork. And because these things are run by different civic bodies, they develop over time into specific civic schools of artwork. And one of the most important and prolific schools of painting during this period is the Sienese school, a wonderful example of which we have here, painting attributed to Bartolo di Fredi. Example of the Sienese school of painting. When you come to see this painting in person up close, you'll recognize and have a chance to look at the really wonderful color that has survived in the egg tempera paint, and also this use of punch work that is really specific to Sienese workshops. This moment, I shouldn't say specific to them, but developed at a very kind of complex and complicated level in the halo that is around Christ's head. This image is also fantastic because it's covered in different types of artistic graffiti. We had a chance to look at this painting just a couple days ago with a conservator from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. We're going to have a chance to look at this painting with raking light and get some close-up photographs to see not just essentially people writing different letters, different names, but even what we think might be the profile of a doodle that shows the profile of somebody's face. So once again, this was not these sorts of graffiti that was added to images was not always something that was thought of as being vandalism or something. It actually was a devotional a feature of the image to kind of add one's own devotional experience by writing on it directly. So we're looking forward to getting some more high-level imagery of this image specifically. If we could just go to the next image. Yes, and I just want to say also that this image is part of a larger altarpiece. Most of the images, many of the images that we're seeing are kind of stripped from their context, typically which would have been within, at least in this case, within a church. Many were part of these much larger altarpieces, where in places like Venice and in Siena and in Florence and Genoa, oftentimes developed these very, very complicated, elaborate, again, collaborations between artisans, painters, and carpenters. And in the 19th and 20th century, when these objects hit the antiquities market or antiques market, they were oftentimes cut down in such a way that they could be sold individually. And so adapting their usage from these large devotional settings and adapting them for essentially a domestic setting. And we'll see another example of that if we go to the next image. This is one of my real sleeper hits, one of the paintings I truly love among the many paintings we've brought through. This is a great example. This is another piece that was probably part of a larger altarpiece from the area of Liguria, which is where Genoa is today. And you can see that the top of this image was probably also gabled, probably triangular, but has been rounded off at the top and fit into a different frame. So the rectilinear frame, of course, being from essentially 1500 onward, the idea of what an artwork is. And so this is just another example of adapting a work of art to kind of fit a modern understanding of how a picture should be shaped. I also want to call attention to this image again, to the wonderful punchwork patterned background in the gilding, and also the area around the Virgin's head in the halo is built up with this pastiglia. So it's essentially a gesso or a paste that's built up and then painted. Something that's really fascinating in medieval art. The most immaterial things, like halos, are oftentimes given the most materiality. And then when we get into Renaissance art, that kind of changes. The halos are much more subtly rendered. So that's something to just really look out for in this exhibition.
So this is one of those Renaissance paintings that was originally rectilinear. It is first and foremost a devotional painting. It represents Saint Sebastian, done around 1500. And Saint Sebastian was a Roman soldier living during the time of Diocletian. He had converted to Christianity, and for that reason, he was tortured for his beliefs. His first form of torture was being shot with arrows. And here we see just one arrow puncturing his body at a perpendicular angle to his body, drawing our attention to it. He did not die from this. He demonstrated his great faith in God. And here we see him looking upward. And my students pointed out when we were there the other day together, his head seems to be glowing. So he doesn't actually have a halo drawn on him or, a disc floating behind him, but there's just a little bit of golden light coming from the top of his head, indicating that his devotion and his faith and God's response to him. And you can see how that light that he's looking upward to comes down, flows down, and illuminates his whole body. He was eventually, just to finish the story of Sebastian, he was eventually martyred, killed and then martyred. He was beaten to death and then thrown into the Cloaca Maxima, the big sewer in Rome. So he did attain sainthood. What's interesting about this representation of Saint Sebastian is, well, a couple of things. The first is that it gave the artist, it's presently attributed to a man named Evangelista. It gave Evangelista an opportunity to paint the male body. This became a standard of achievement in the Renaissance because it was based on the emulation of ancient art. A lot of ancient art, we see nude gods and nude goddesses. We see perfectly rendered forms, perfect anatomy. And so the standard becomes being able to represent human anatomy, in that sense, understanding nature, but also being able to perfect it and to make it look more beautiful than any single individual, to sort of select from many individuals to come up with a perfect whole. And we can see that our painter, Evangelista, has achieved a very beautiful rendering of the human body. There's a nice sense of movement. Do you notice how one of his legs is straight and stiff and supported his body weight? The other one is hanging more freely. That's a pose called contrapposto that we find in a lot of ancient statues. So, he's demonstrating his knowledge of the ancient world and of nature. And one of the things that he's able to do here in really translating, we could say, the qualities of an ancient Apollo to this Christian Saint Sebastian, is he's able to create a kind of glowing quality to the surface of Sebastian's skin and to darken it and emphasize the shadows. And by creating that contrast between deeper shadows and brighter highlights, the three-dimensional form of his body appears to project outward toward us. And he creates those effects through the use of oil on panel. So the Renaissance was a time of innovation in subject. It was also a time of innovation in technique, in painting technique. And the use of oil was exploited to create more subtle effects of light and shadow. One more point to make about this Saint Sebastian is that Evangelista, the artist to whom it's been attributed, is working in a tradition, a lineage of large-scale single figures of Saint Sebastian that stretches back to the mid-15th century. The one I'm showing you here was done in the 1490s, so just a few years before his own, and it is done by the artist Perugino. Now, our painter, Evangelista, was associated with Perugino as well as with Raphael. And Raphael was a student or an associate of Perugino, and he's the one who sort of emerges as this great artist in the early 16th century. So we have Evangelista demonstrating his artistic lineage, his artistic chops, by modeling his figure on Perugino, but also, I think, demonstrating his own individual style. He makes his figure much whiter and brighter than Perugino's sort of warm tonality. And in that way, I think, brings his figure of Sebastian closer to those ancient statues of Apollo. So really kind of highlighting and reinforcing not just the artistic lineage to ancient art, but also the fact that Sebastian lived during the age of antiquity. So that kind of artistic feature has meaning for this devotional image as well.
And maybe we just want to say that something to notice when you go through the exhibition is, again, this pervasive use of putting the body on display, and not just represent a nude body, but also something that is isolated, that is essentially squared up for devotion, is pushed forward into the viewer's the space of encounter with the viewer as this way of showing proof. Okay, you cannot deny that this happened because the body is here and it is on display. I think that's something that's so interesting about Christian art is that the things that become the instrument of death for the saint become that saint's vehicle towards salvation. Okay, so the thing that kills you is the thing that becomes your attribute, right? The image of a cross is essentially a Roman torture instrument. Okay, that we've been reconceived into essentially a symbol of an entire salvation history of a religion. So too, similarly, the image of the arrow, which is the symbol of Sebastian's torture, becomes the symbol that kind of gives him a salvation, that gives him legitimacy, that earns him a martyr's crown. So this kind of flipping of the uh, the torment as being the thing that provides salvation is something that's really interesting about Christian art more broadly. And just again, seeing um, that evidence of that torturous event on display is a big part of the verification of these images.
We wanted to finish with this image, a portrait by the artist Giovanni Bellini. The portrait represents a man named Gabriele Veneto. He was an Augustinian friar. He became general of the Order of Hermits in 1516. And we end here because it represents a number of the themes that we've been talking about. Certainly, it represents the theme of authorship. If you want a famous Venetian Renaissance artist, the name Bellini rings forth. He even has a drink named after him. But Giovanni Bellini was from this workshop, a family workshop, very traditional training, but he emerges as a highly innovative artist. And there he becomes a painter whom art collectors want in their collection. And we're talking about collectors going way back to around the year 1500. A woman like Isabella d'Este desperately wanted a Bellini painting. So much so that in the end, she didn't even care what the subject matter was, but she simply wanted something by his hand. He was one of the subjects that he did specialize in. He painted a whole range of subjects, very versatile artist, very talented. But one of the things that he did very well were portraits. And I think that we can, think about here how he's able to achieve the goals of portraiture in the Renaissance, which was to make the absent present, right? This portrait lives on long after the death of Bellini, long after the death of the sitter. The sitter lives on because of the representation of his features, his physical form, the carnality of his being. We can see how Bellini is very skillfully using color glazes in oil paint. So he's able to get those luminous effects, very subtle color effects, a bit of yellow, a bit of rose, a bit of grayish green shadow in there. And all of these things formulate for us the shape of his head, the rotundity of his head. He's present for us. Bellini remains present in this painting too, through in part because of his recognizable style, but also through his signature. And we see here this third line says Ioannis Bellinis. So he imprints his name on this object, and in that sense also attains a kind of immortality through his artwork.
Yeah, the author providing authority. So something that we go for about almost nearly a 1,000-year period in which Italian paintings have no signatures, virtually no signatures, to it being essentially the standard, something that a painting had to have so as to give it value and prove that it's real. So it's a great way to end the exhibition on this particular image. So we just want to say once again, thank you so much for the opportunity to come and talk with us today. We look forward to hearing your questions. And we just want to really just underscore once again what a tremendous opportunity it is to have these paintings on campus for our teaching, for our research, for scholarly opportunities, for collaborative opportunities. We look forward to seeing you at the museum.
So, well, I have to say, it would be hard to thank you enough for this wonderful, illuminating introduction to medieval Renaissance. And Federico, I hope you're happy with what you made possible for us.
Yeah.
This has really been a great project, and we're really profoundly grateful to Stephanie and John for their scholarship and really for the care with which you've taken in shaping this exhibition, and to Federico and Daisy for your generosity in allowing us to choose from your vast collection enough works so that we could really tell a good story. So thank you all so much. Now I'm going to look to see if we have anything in the chat. And I don't think we have any questions in the chat. So I think maybe we should just open it up to those assembled to say a few words. And I see that, Elaine, you have your hand up.
John, I had a question, and this came a little bit more from the talk that you gave to the docents the other day. But when you were discussing the painting of the well, it says Saint Joseph here, but I think it changed to unidentified saint later on. But you mentioned about it being made of tempera, and I was struck by how incredibly vivid the colors were. And I was wondering if tempera retains its color better than oil paint does.
Thanks so much, Elaine, for the question. I might actually flip it to Stephanie because I mean, in terms of technique, I guess you could say that we talk about tempera, we talk about oil paint, but of course, within those techniques, there's all sorts of different techniques that are being tried out and worked with. Sometimes tempera has an amazing retention of color, particularly when it has the opportunity to be kind of cleaned and touched up over time. But sometimes, there's something kind of off in the recipe, and it maybe peels more, and it doesn't have the color in the same way. Generally speaking, I'd say that oil paint has the opportunity to provide a much larger range of color. But I'd say that yeah, it depends on the recipe, and what's really nice is that we do have a number of surviving recipes from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance that allow us to kind of reconstruct these things. But this is when work with conservators becomes absolutely key in helping us reconstruct how these things were made.
Yeah, and I would only add to that that I don't think it's that either tempera or oil stays better preserved one or the other. As John's saying, it depends on how it was made, how that individual work was made. But the only thing I would call attention to is that it's all about, well, it's about the pigments for sure, but it's also about the binder. So in egg yolk tempera, you're using egg yolk, which is an opaque material. It tends to give you a kind of matte surface. The colors can be very, very vivid and can last very long. Very bright, very beautiful. With oil, because you're suspending pigments in oil, you can do a whole range of effects. It's a lot more flexible in the sense that it dries more slowly. You can add a very small amount of pigment, make it more liquidy. You can add greater amounts of pigment and create some very sparkling, very precise effects. And of course, because it's oil, light can also penetrate that. So that's why you get sort of that glowing quality, and you can get much more subtle effects. I think that's a big difference too. We see that in the Saint Sebastian painting. So they're very different in terms of what you can get out of them.
Hey, thank you.
I think we have another question, Meg Nocero, who has raised her hand.
Hi, yes. I loved your presentation. I think it's fantastic that you have this exhibit at Boston College. I am actually, I got my BA from Boston College in 1991, so I love being brought back to the school again. I'm getting my PhD right now in what's tantamount happiness studies, but it's about human flourishing. And a lot of art, what you've spoken to today, is really important in the whole idea of bringing the medieval to modernity. And I just kept thinking that I hope that I know you recorded this, but maybe you can put it up in like a TV screen so it can speak to people when they're going through the exhibit, because how you examine the different pieces of the different details of the art really brings it to light, and especially in light of the fact that the humanity of the artist comes through, as well as obviously the reasons why it was done. Certainly, you were talking about you know teaching families when they had these big art pieces to bring it into the households. But I thought that would be a great idea, because I know that looking at this, especially with both of you, if it could use the recording to actually teach people who go through the exhibit, that would be a fantastic addition.
Thank you, Meg. We really appreciate that. And this conversation that we're having here is built from this. It's part of this dialogue that we're trying to set up, and we do have really quite extensive object files, object labels that we put in to the exhibition. That was really were made collaboratively among between me and Stephanie, but also with Nancy, with Kate, with other people involved, that kind of try to capture aspects of this dialogues that we've had about these paintings going back over a year. So we hope that that's captured in the exhibition.
And I think we probably will post this on our website, Meg, if you want to watch it and recommend it to your friends who come to see the exhibition as well. Anything else? Any other questions that we... Federico, would you like to say a few words
No,
about your collection here?
I can only thanks John and Stephanie for the beautiful and exhaustive, very nice introduction of all the art history. This is one of the most stunning period, going through medieval and Renaissance, and it's basically not only in art, but a bank system, society system, law system is what we live in now. It started there at the time in Europe, in Italy, especially in Florence. So it's and we through the art we can have a glimpse of what was the time and what brings to our modern civilization. So it's just thank you, and then we will speak at the exhibition, and I will give a perspective more as a collector than an art historian, but because of course the approach is a little bit different, but both we love art, and so we can see tomorrow. But I just thank you. It's a beautiful how you done. Actually, it's incredible. Something like when you get in and you see the Christ on the right with a beautiful entrance. It's so suggestive and beautiful. It gives you the idea to go inside a church, to go inside that time that it was so, it's a medieval time, and the cross there that it goes something in between the first Giotto and when he goes to Assisi is like a kind of reaction of a country. I don't know how about Umbrian Marquisan painter that react to the first real Renaissance movement. That was Giotto that bring it there. So he tried to give some different prospect, but he's still eradicated on the carpenting and on the medieval side of the picture. So, and this beauty looks great there. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Federico. And we have to thank Diana Larson for the fabulous design of the exhibition. She's really a wonder.
Yeah, she did a fabulous job on this. So thank you all again. Thank you all for joining us today. And before we conclude, I warmly encourage all of you to experience the exhibition either in person or virtually, and to join us for the many free programs we're offering in connection with the exhibition. You can find a full schedule on our website. And I also want to remind you that our next program will be a virtual lecture on Wednesday evening, September 10th, by John McCoy, who is the curator of another of our current exhibitions in the Monin Gallery on the photography of Nobel laureate Martin Karplus. Anyway, we look forward to welcoming you to the McMullen, whether in the galleries or online. And until then, thank you for joining us today. Be well.
Thank you.